Next on The Impossible State, DPRK-Russia relations, the visit of Kim Jong-un to meet with Vladimir Putin, with one of this country's top Russia experts. Next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome to The Impossible State. My name is Ellen Kim, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Korea Chair here at CSIS, and the moderator for today's show. Today we are going to talk about a very timely topic, the summit between Kim Jong-un and Russian leader Vladimir Putin. And I can't think of a better expert to discuss the topic than the 2 guests we have here with us today, Victor Cha and Angela Stent. As our listeners know, Victor Cha is one of the hosts of this program, but just for today, he's joining as a special honor guest. But let me properly introduce him. Victor Cha is a Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS, as well as Distinguished University Professor at Georgetown University. Angela Stent is a Senior Advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and Professor Emerita of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She is also a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Brookings Institutions and co-chairs its Hewitt Forum on Post-Soviet Affairs. She's a Senior Advisor to the USIP. She serves on the Board of a Visitor of the Marine Corps University. From 2004 to 2006, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And from 1999 to 2001, she served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. Her primary research focus is Russian foreign policy with a special emphasis on the triangular U.S.-Europe-Russia relationship. She has an impressive book publication record, but for the interest of time, if I highlight her latest book, which you can see on the screen at the back, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. This book won the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy's Prize for the best book on U.S.-Russian relationship. And this year, this book was published in an updated version with a new chapter on the Russia-Ukraine war. So with that, let me start with Dr. Stanton. Given that you have a very timely book on the war in Ukraine and based on your deep understanding of Putin and his worldview, how would you assess his motivation to turn to North Korea and meet with Kim Jong-un? Do you see that as a sign of weakness and desperation, as many other people claim? And how do you think that this meeting will be received by Russian people domestically?
So thank you for having me on the podcast. This was a real reversal of fortune for, Vladimir Putin and the great Russian state to come as a supplicant, essentially, to the leader of North Korea asking for ammunition. Russia is running out of ammunition and artillery. North Korea has large stockpiles of it, actually much of it from the Soviet period. So in a way, it's giving back what was given to it by the Soviets. If we assume that there was an arms deal, and of course, we don't know concretely what's come out of the summit, but we have to assume, and our government and other governments believe that that's what will happen. So on the one hand, you could say it's humiliating for him. He has to turn to the leader of the most isolated country in the world and ask for kind of old-fashioned ammunition. But I see this also as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Putin has in the back of his mind the creation of this post-West New World Order, turning his back on the West, looking toward China, obviously, as the main partner, but in a sense engaging with leaders in Asia and other countries, for want of a better word, the global South, who may be authoritarian leaders, but who are neutral in this war, who don't want to take sides, and in fact increasing Russia's influence in some of these countries. So you could also say this is a way now he's elevating, of course, Kim Jong-un to a much higher status than he's had before, but it's part of Putin's desire to create these new, if not alliances, at least partnerships, and show that Russia can still dominate in some areas of the world, even if it's rejected by the West.
Wow.
And as for the Russian population, in my conversations with Russians before the war began, when I used to go to Russia, many Russian experts spoke quite disparagingly about North Korea, about this kind of hermit kingdom, about the fact, about the extreme authoritarianism and isolation of the country. So I cannot believe that for the average Russian person, they see this necessarily as a great triumph for Russia. But no doubt Putin and the Russian media will present it as such. And I've been watching the media since Kim Jong-un's visit began, and of course, they've been much more positive.
So let me turn to Dr. Cha. This summit meeting between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin took place at the Russia spaceport. So what does that mean? And if North Korea launches a successful satellite launch in the next few months, what impact will this have on the U.S. extended deterrence in Asia?
So let me first start by picking up where Angela left off, which is this point about role reversal. It wasn't too long ago that it was the North Koreans that kept going to the Soviet Union, then to Russia for help. At first, they wanted loan forgiveness, right? Then they wanted the resumption of sort of Cold War era pricing for fuel, right? All of that stopped in 1990 when the Soviet Union normalized relations with South Korea and got a $3 billion loan from South Korea. They were not going to turn around and then continue to subsidize oil exports to North Korea. And they were always looking to Russia for technology, right, for their missiles. Some of their older missiles are basically based on Soviet engines. So all this time, they've been sort of the supplicant, and now we have this role reversal, as Angela said. And so if we look at the case starting from July, right, July of this past year on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the armistice, what North Koreans called Victory Day, the defense minister, Shoigu, as we see in this picture, went to North Korea. Kim Jong-un treated him very well, extremely well. Like, we would not expect Kim Jong-un to treat somebody. So, given the myth-making in North Korea, they were clearly trying to send a signal about what they wanted to do with Russia. And so I think, as Angela said, the governments have been talking about an arms deal. Like, we're pretty certain there's an arms deal there. When the White House announced that there was that first, what they suspected to be the first major arms shipment to the Wagner Group, they released satellite imagery of that. We here at CSIS then used the date stamp on that satellite imagery to take more pictures of the border, the Tumangan-Kasan railroad border. And so if we look at those pictures very quickly, we can show you that shortly after that arms shipment took place, and we can go to the imagery right now. Shortly after that arms shipment took place, you can see here the date, December 15th, 2022, and you can see here, right, these are all oil petroleum tanker cars that are at the border between North Korea and Russia. And then we see here in the next picture. So this is the Kasan rail facility, and here you can see, we can tell from the shape of the cars that these are ore cars, right? These are ore cars that are moving between the two sides. So very clearly, there is a lot going on between the two. Now, the visit to the space station, to me, is very ominous. It's not a good sign. As Angela knows well, like when you set up these summit meetings, whether they happen in the West or in the East, you don't pick places for no reason, right? And the fact that they picked the space facility at a time when we have seen North Korea fail 2 military satellite launches makes pretty clear that they are looking for technology in terms of launching their military satellites. Then he is also going to visit. He's going to see like the Russian Pacific Fleet, I think they said.
Yes.
And North Korea just rolled out a diesel-powered submarine that can launch 10 sea-launched ballistic missiles, but they want a nuclear-powered submarine, right? And so I'm worried about that too. So I think all of this makes one concerned that, at least from my perspective, Kim Jong-un, the so-called great North Korean leader, would not take a train all the way to Russia just for food. Right. There's got to be something else here,
Yeah.
and based on all these places they're going, and now that we've learned the news that he's staying longer, that there's a lot going on here. What does this mean for deterrence on the peninsula? Very clearly, the United States and Korea have created this new nuclear consultative group, the Washington Declaration, all meant to try to shore up extended deterrence. I think that's still I think that's still there, and I think it's still very important. But this just creates new challenges for the two allies. But I would say it's not like we didn't expect it. Like we would expect that North Korea was going to launch a military satellite sooner or later, and going to launch ICBMs and try to improve their submarines. With Russian support, they may just do that sooner rather than later.
If I could just add something to this. For years, right, Russia was part of these six-party talks, at least nominally and publicly committed to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and that North Korea should not acquire nuclear weapons, even though when you talk to Russians privately, you understood that for them, the threat of a united Korea as part of the West was greater than the threat of North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons. But now, when Mr. Shoigu, and the photo you just showed, went to North Korea to celebrate the anniversary, the nuclear weapons were brought out and everyone was clapping. So I think this means this is the end of Russia trying to, persuade the North Koreans maybe to give up their nuclear weapons program. So I do think it's an ominous sign. And when Putin was asked yesterday about would you help North Korea with satellite technology, he said yes, that's what he's here for.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is my question to you, Dr. Stent. Following up on what you just said, there's a deep concern about whether Russia will abide by the UN security resolutions, and Putin indicated publicly that there are some restrictions in Russia's cooperation with North Korea. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so Russia did agree to the initial sanctions against North Korea, and to some extent it abided by them. But we do know that, all the laborers, there were a lot of North Korean laborers in the Russian Far East. Not all of them returned to North Korea. They're still there. And there were other signs that Russia was evading these sanctions and helping the North Koreans get, I think, some oil imports and things like that. So yes, Putin repeated yesterday that there are some sanctions that Russia will still abide by, but I think we'll have to watch that very carefully. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're abiding by it less than they were before, just because, they want whatever weapons they're going to get from the North Koreans, and that's their imperative so they can continue, prosecuting the war in Ukraine.
Dr. Cha, so Chinese foreign minister will likely meet with Russian foreign minister soon, and there is a chance that President Xi Jinping will meet with the President Putin at the Belt and Road Forum in November. So if these meetings take place, then how would you read this?
Well, so the first thing, if I could just add to what Angela said about sanctions evasion, I agree. I worked on the six-party talks.
Right.
Since 2006,
Yeah.
Russia has signed on to 10 UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea. 10, right? But then there's this amazing picture of Shoigu and Kim at the
Right.
Victory Day celebrations as all of these ballistic missiles go rolling by, all of them, every single one of them, a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. So that's not a very good sign in terms of continued compliance. They may find some fig leaf to say, oh yeah, we're complying, but the overall political message, I think, is pretty clear. They're not. And if they provide satellite technology, of course they'll call it civilian space launch capabilities. They'll say that this is the sovereign right of North Korea to receive this, and the Russians are helping them. But UN Security Council resolutions very clearly say that North Korea's pursuit of a civilian space launch vehicle program is also a violation of UN Security Council resolutions because the technology they use is basically ballistic missile technology. So, in terms of China, I think it's interesting because I think this is a real problem for China.
Yeah.
He and Xi and Putin talked about they talked about this friendship, this something,
No limits.
no limits, right? No limits partnership or
Yeah.
something like that. But I think I don't think the Chinese have said anything yet, and I think it's very difficult for them because on the one hand, they don't like Putin and Kim getting too close, right? The Chinese basically feel like they have ownership over North Korea, and so they don't like anybody to get too close. And when Trump talked about doing summit meetings with Kim, Xi Jinping at that point had not met with Kim Jong-un. He had not met him yet. But then when Trump talked about doing summit meetings, Xi Jinping met with Kim 5 times. But then when the summits failed, Xi Jinping stopped meeting with Kim. So now because Kim and Putin are like, they're all over the news, Kim is staying longer, right? They're very happy together. That puts pressure on Xi Jinping to try to engage more and not alienate the two of them. On the other hand, do they really want to be a part of this and be seen as responsible for prolonging and fueling the war in Ukraine? I mean, every time North Korea does something bad, everybody blames China because they say you have all the influence. So I think on the other side, China doesn't want to support this. So they're really under these, like, they're very conflicting sort of cross currents. Personally, I think it is entirely in Chinese interests not to support this, but they have chosen to connect their North Korea policy with U.S.-China relations, and they say as long as the United States is doing supply chains and all this Taiwan and all this other stuff with China, we're not going to work with them on North Korea, even though in this case it would entirely be in their interests to disconnect themselves from this unholy alliance. So.
There are some rumors, I don't know whether you've heard them, that Kim Jong-un might go to visit China when he's done with his visit in Russia, which would be very interesting to watch if that happens.
That would be interesting, and that would definitely show that China had made a choice. Right,
exactly.
Right. It would definitely show that China had made a choice. If they did do that, I mean, then we really would see a cementing of this three-way relationship, and really, then you just have bipolar blocks in Asia, right? The U.S., Japan, and Korea on one side, and then China, Soviet Union, China, Russia, and North Korea on the other side.
So here's my final question then. So where do we go from now here? And how should the U.S. and its allies in Europe and Asia respond, basically?
Well, I mean, we have, Victor Cha already mentioned it. We have to shore up the relationship. It's very good that we had the meeting with South Korea and Japan and President Biden, because obviously the relationship between South Korea and Japan is not uncomplicated. And it's very good that there was this meeting and this commitment and a renewed U.S. commitment to both of our Asian allies. I also think it's very good that NATO is, paying more attention to the Asian allies. We've had a little blip with the French who didn't want to open a NATO office in Japan, but anyway, but I think that will be very important going forward. We can criticize, obviously, and we will criticize the Russian-North Korean meeting. If we ever find out what they agreed on, I'm sure we'll criticize that too. But the U.S. has very little, I would say, leverage there. And I think the other thing that Putin has been doing by meeting Kim Jong-un is also to further intimidate the South Koreans, to sort of try and punish them for the fact that South Korea did join the sanctions regime. It has condemned what Russia has done, and yet the South Koreans have noticed increased North Korean, harassing activities. So I think for all those reasons, just shoring up our allies in Asia and, making sure that the coalition stays.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's, no foreign policy decision is taken for only one reason. And so for Kim and Putin, there's clearly a transactional reason to do this. But another is that Putin can send a message to South Korea. This is what happens when you support the war in Ukraine. And Kim can send a message both to the United States and South Korea to say, look, I can cause problems for you not just on the peninsula, but in Europe as well, right? By arming Putin. I can't imagine he's giving Putin the best stuff he's got, but as Anna said, this war has shown us that there's a munitions stockpile shortage all around the world when we have a war of this nature. But the one place where there's a lot of munitions is on the Korean Peninsula, where there are stockpiles of munitions is on the Korean Peninsula. On what the United States can do, I agree. There are not many levers here. The sort of pat response would be to go to the UN Security Council, right? Seek more resolutions, list more individuals and entities involved in these transactions, but we can't do that now because Russia and China are not going to support that. So I do think these other groupings, NATO leaders summit plus the Asia Pacific Four, right? Plus Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, or G7, right? Which also this year included Korea, Australia, Indonesia, and others. I think these are sort of the venues in which you cannot pass resolutions like the UN, but you can certainly coordinate policy, right? And so I think increasingly they're going to have to look to things like that. Of course, U.S., Japan, Korea, trilateral arrangements as well. But more broadly, I think, because the Ukraine war has really collapsed the theaters, like it's all one theater now, that these other, which previously had largely been sort of Europe-based groupings, will take on, I think, a more important role in terms of global governance overall, because the UN Security Council can't. And this is the Ukraine war, but now this is one of their biggest challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, but let me add one more question there. So you see that there is a growing, like all this violations of multiple UN Security Council resolutions, and that means that there's a huge implication on the rules-based international order. And what does that mean for us, and what should we do about this? What kind of world are we facing going forward?
Well, if you ask Vladimir Putin, right, when he talks about the post-West order, it's the post-West disorder. I mean, what Putin and the people around him want is, in a sense, a world order where there are no rules. And that's where I think the Chinese and the Russians disagree about that, even though they both want a world order where the U.S., doesn't dominate. But we've already seen Russia violate so many, the United Nations Charter by invading a sovereign country which did nothing to provoke it. So I think the challenge is to try and retain as much as one can of that rules-based international order when you have at least one country that's willing to violate it, even though Russia claims to be one of the great supporters of the United Nations. But unfortunately, in the Ukraine war, we've seen, how powerless the United Nations is to stop or affect any of this, because you have Russia and China with a veto.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, the Ukraine war is a threat to the core of the liberal international order. Having said that, we've seen NATO rally. We've seen, things in Asia. We've seen things like the Quad, AUKUS, Camp David, U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral. So in many ways, there has been a response to this, and of course, the story is not over. It's not nearly over, but I would agree. I mean, there is the war itself and what Putin is trying to gain there, but there is what he hopes will happen to the international order as a result of it. Both China, Russia, and North Korea would certainly all like to see the United States' role, its legitimacy as a leader, its dependability. They would like to see that all be destroyed by the Ukraine war and by these arms deals and everything else. So that's what's at stake. We all know what's at stake, and I think that the growing consolidation of the U.S. alliance network in Asia is, of course, related to China's assertiveness and North Korea's weapons. But if not for the war in Ukraine, I don't think we'd be seeing the response that we're seeing now, because everybody thought like we wouldn't have wars like this. And for it to happen like this, I think it's changed the way every leader in Asia thinks about security. When I go to Asia, nobody asks me about North Korea anymore. They ask me about, and I don't know. So they asked me about the Ukraine war, like the question. But then the other uncertainty they asked me about is U.S. politics. Right?
Even more uncertain.
Even more uncertain. So those are sort of the two things. But but it's a real challenge. But I think the United States and allies are trying to meet that challenge.
I see. Well, very excellent. This was a really insightful and very timely discussion. I really appreciate both of you taking time to join us. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you again for joining us on The Impossible State. We look forward to seeing you join us in future podcasts. Thank you, and we will see you soon.